Welcome to Export Development Canada presents the Walrus Talks Clean Tech. I am indeed Shelley Ambrose, Executive Director of the Walrus. I want to thank Cleantech Export Forum and the EDC for inviting the Walrus to be part of this event. As you know, this event is meant to encourage, inspire, and empower you in the clean tech sector to keep growing, thinking domestically and globally because the world needs you, your talents and solutions. We at the Walrus share this sense of optimism and supportive spirit. This optimistic project called the Walrus started 16 years ago, and we recognize that Canada's conversation is complex and necessary, and it takes many forms at the Walrus through fact-based journalism, in the Walrus magazine, and in rooms like this at the Walrus Talks. So no matter where the Walrus is or how it is consumed, we embrace our commitment to be independent and to bring together interesting and interested people who care about the issues that matter. So out of curiosity, how many have read The Walrus in print, online, or on your phone? God, that's fantastic, welcome. And how many have attended a Walrus Talks before? Generally, we're public. Oh, there's a couple of you, that's great. Welcome back. So this afternoon's session is our 120th Walrus Talks, and we know if you're in this room, you're a person of influence and you make decisions. You have some great ideas, expertise, and you certainly recognize opportunity. So when we were invited by EDC to bring the Walrus Talks to you today, we set out to bring you some of the same. So our Walrus Talkers today are bringing you their leadership perspectives and ideas on the future of clean tech for all Canadians. We hope once you've heard them, you'll walk away thinking, I never thought of it that way, and you'll have lots to talk about at the post-talks reception. So here's how the Walrus Talks works. Each talker, there are 5 of them, has 7 minutes each. They know this. Each will come up and introduce themselves. If you would like to follow along, please grab this green thing that's on your table. Speaker order on the front. Their longer bios are on the back. I am not going to read their bios to you because I know that you can follow along. You'll hear 5 of them in a row, and just before I let them get underway, I'd like to thank each in advance. So thank you to Daniel Pino, Principal, Cycle Capital Management. Thank you to Steve Lee, Executive Director, Foundation for Environmental Stewardship. Thank you to Christine Bergeron, Chief Member Services Officer, Van City Credit Union. Thank you to Christopher Henderson, President, Lumos Energy, Executive Director, IC Social Enterprise, co-founder, the Delphi Group. And thank you to Stefan Joaquin, founder and managing partner, Energus Ventures. Thank you all for being here. Let us begin.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan Pino from Cycle Capital, a clean tech venture fund. Today I'm going to be talking about the resurgence of clean tech venture investing and ways that we can accelerate disruptive technologies that have meaningful impact on climate change. Despite the efforts of many, global carbon emissions went up last year. There's a lot of positive trends such as the proliferation of solar and wind deployments as well as electric vehicles, but there's a clear need for breakthrough technologies if we want to have any hope of limiting global temperature rise to less than 2 degrees centigrade. From a venture investing standpoint, there is good news. Last year, there was $9 billion invested by venture and private equity firms in clean technologies. So the question is, what's driving this surge in capital? There are several key factors. First and foremost, unless you've got your head in the sand or don't believe in real science, most people acknowledge that climate change is real and it's a problem. And this wasn't the case 10 years ago. The result has been a surge of dollars by progressive institutional investors, by large strategics like utilities and oil and gas, as well as government entities. The second is that people have become much more informed on how to impact carbon emissions. And this has resulted in a much larger investable universe for clean tech companies. In the past, technology focus in clean tech areas were around solar thin film, biofuels, and areas like this. And today there's a much wider range. For example, the fund that I work for invests in both hardware and software. And there's really 5 technology buckets that were focused around areas that we believe has a significant impact on carbon emissions. This is clean power, sustainable agriculture, industrial IoT, clean transportation, and smart cities. And the third is that for those traditional clean tech investments that are by nature capital intensive or have manufacturing-based business models, venture investors now better understand the sector, and they've adapted to those challenges in front of them, which is what I'd like to talk about. So in summary, capital is becoming more available, there are more areas to invest it in, and investors better understand the sector. All that said, I truly believe that the most meaningful impacts are going to come from those traditional clean tech sectors that are, as I said, capital intensive, are difficult to scale up, and have customers like utilities and regulators to deal with. So I'd like to talk about three ways that I think can help accelerate these types of companies, and draw on a couple examples from our portfolio companies. The first is getting in front of the customer. This sounds very simple, but it's not. In the regulated world, such as utilities, they typically run competitive public processes where, in theory, the best company or technology should win. In reality, it's not always the case. If the evaluator is not as familiar with those new disruptive technologies compared to the status quo, they won't be able to ask the pertinent questions in a way that allows an apples-to-apples comparison. So the companies that we've seen that have been very successful in this space have actually brought on people that are familiar with the utility space, that talk the language, know how they work, and that can work with them. I think a great example of this is long-duration batteries. There's a huge need for long-duration energy storage because of the solar and wind deployments that are there today. And lithium-ion batteries, which are the most well-known and fastest-growing batteries, like the ones you have in your laptops or your cell phones, is actually getting selected for some of these long-duration applications. But they're actually much better suited for short-duration applications. So the question is, why is this? Some of it is because, of course, they're farther ahead in the cost curve. But the other key factor is because the evaluation process is set up around lithium-ion batteries. One of our portfolio companies, ESS, which is a manufacturer of iron-sodium hybrid flow batteries, has a technology that is very well suited for long-duration storage. And they recognized this problem early on. So what they did is they brought on people that are very familiar with utilities, knows how to work with them, and got in front of the utilities to inform them of the benefits. Again, this sounds very simple, but to actually get the benefits across the utility that were focused around lower life cycle costs, limited fire risk, non-hazardous materials, allowed them to develop a really big pipeline. So they've done that very well. The second area I'd like to mention is partnering with strategics. Again, sounds simple on the surface, but it's not an easy thing to do. Having a strategic investor invest in your fund means you've got to strategically align the founders, the financials, and the strategics so that they're all on the same page. A great example of this is one of our portfolio companies called Enerchem. Enerchem is a company that has a disruptive technology that converts municipal local solid waste, in other words, garbage, into cellulosic, methanol, ethanol, and other renewable chemicals. They recently partnered with a large oil and gas major, Suncor, who invested $50 million into them, but more importantly, provided them with technical expertise and know-how. So Suncor is one of the largest world-class operators of large chemical processing plants, provided actual personnel and expertise for the Edmonton facility, which is a one-of-its-kind facility in the world. And the results have been game-changing for that company. And finally, the third area I'd like to mention is on the financing front at the project level. I don't think the fundamentals here have really changed. The companies we've seen that are most successful are the ones that work with insurance, as well as engineering, procurement contractors early on, in order to make sure that when they do eventually develop their technology, that it is financeable. However, there's a couple of really interesting market developments, which is really helpful for those companies. There's been a big ad for project finance, so there's a big surge in that finance availability. Some VC firms are actually now raising project finance funds alongside their venture funds. Other infrastructure or project finance funds are actually partnering with VCs or launching their own VCs in order to take advantage of some of those new technologies and build out their portfolio. And so what are the key drivers of this? There's really a surplus of capital availability for infrastructure funds. And especially in the renewable energy space, it's gotten very competitive and returns are getting bid down. So as a result of this, they're looking to get creative and find different ways to generate those returns. And that's a great great position to be in for those technology companies, because now these financiers are willing to take more risk and find those niche opportunities. The second point and final point I'll make is that over the past decade, companies and financiers have gotten much more creative around the models that they've developed. So whether it's joint venture agreements, license models, build to own, operate, and transfer models, or contract manufacturing models, the bottom line is that there's simply much more options out there for clean tech companies. And if there's a strong offering, I truly believe that it should get funded. So with that, I hope I've left you with a very positive view on the space. Despite the challenges ahead, we're at an inflection point, particularly in Canada, where we've been seeding leading research institutions and seeding companies. With the surge of capital availability, we're at a great position to see these companies through. So thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the talk.
Hi, my name is Steve Lee. I run the 3% Project. The 3% Project mobilizes 1 million students across Canada and 500 high schools to ask the question, what kind of future do we want? And we explore the topics of climate change and sustainability and how they can develop and gain the skills they need to create that kind of future, a future that's more inclusive, fair, prosperous, and sustainable. We mobilize 1 million students in 500 high schools, particularly located in remote, rural, conservative, and resource-based communities. Cities like here, Toronto, have those resources. Young people do have those resources and teachers who know how to teach it. Most rural communities and resource-based communities, they don't have, if any, opportunities to really be engaged in this kind of narrative. And so that's what I do. And what I want to talk about here mainly with you is to think about what kind of future do you want? What kind of future does your sector intend to help create? What is your story? And what is the narrative of clean tech here in Canada around the world? Because I don't think that message, if it exists, is known to the larger kind of zeitgeist moment of our generation or the larger public. Even the phrase clean tech is not very well known. Maybe people know renewable energy, but it's not all that well known. And particularly, its benefits are not very well known. People don't choose to do something because of what it is or how easy it is to do. People do it because they like the why. What benefit does this exactly have for me? And I don't think that's exactly known out there. The author of Petite Prince, he talks about how if you want people to go build ships, don't break them up into teams and send them into forests to cut wood to make ship. Take them to the sea and let them admire the longing vastness of the sea, and they'll build the ship themselves. And every time I go to these kind of conferences to learn about the topic and to network, and I find that people complain all the time that our customers and our sector and market doesn't really understand the benefits of how amazing the clean tech sector is. And that's again and again what I hear as one of the systemic barriers in this field, but no one's really going out there and telling that story. What is the narrative here for the future of clean tech? And Canada is a country of many, many narratives. It is incredibly diverse, and as I've traveled from coast to coast to coast, I visited over 300 schools and over 250 towns that I physically visited and talked to people. And Canada is really, really, really big and diverse. And I mean, the community of Tuktoyaktuk, for example, right on the Arctic Ocean in Northwest Territories, they've experienced already over 6 Celsius degrees of warming. Several houses and roads are already underwater due to coastal erosion. The entire community is expected to be under the water within the next 32 years. They don't have Arctic char anymore in the Arctic. The ice for the Arctic is supposed to melt starting June, and it fully melts around August, and that's when they know for the summer to have arrived. And beluga whale usually arrives by the time it's August. This year, all of the sea ice melted by June 3rd, and the beluga whale returned by June 4th. That's not normal. Or another community of northern Alberta, of Garden Creek, a remote community of Indigenous people who don't really speak English much. The entire community speaks Cree, and they try to go renewable. And similarly to Fort Chipewyan, communities have been, as one of the chiefs have told me, they've been held as economic and environmental hostages to go with industrial partners that government only places before them. If they don't, they have no other options. Or communities that I go into, post-mining communities or forestry communities in rural areas that are really designed to extract the raw materials so that we could have served our lords over in Britain. Canada was largely set up as a colony in the beginning, and Western Canada was developed to serve Eastern Canada to serve the colony over in Britain. And I don't think Canada really graduated from the mindset of a colony to extract raw materials as cheaply as we can and then export it to around the world, but really in a limited market. And clean tech sector is something that could change that narrative. I don't know if that narrative exists. And this is something that I find again and again something kind of confusing as I go around and talk about the benefits of renewable energy and how the communities could go transfer into that. That kind of idea doesn't really exist outside of cities and these small bubbles of clean tech and sustainability sectors. I've been at the forefront of kind of receiving the other universe of facts in other parts of the country that operate on a whole different idea of what environment and climate change and oil and gas and clean sector is. Just yesterday, apparently, my photo was largely blown up into one of the screens during the Wexit rally in Edmonton because I'm Hitler. That's indoctrinating their children, which is many of the letters that I receive. And yeah, and the idea of why we need to transition into this kind of future is not very well advertised. It's not told. The story doesn't really exist. But we know those stories. We know why we want to move towards this kind of inclusive, fair, prosperous, and sustainable future, not only to avoid some of the calamities, but because it is substantially better future than we have. It is substantially more economical. It is substantially better for the future generations. We have all these ideas. If you were to close your eyes and imagine what 2050 that's fully decarbonized and electrified should look like, I bet you could imagine that. But most people around Canada cannot imagine that. Then the ask to give up the life that they've known, that their parents and grandparents had in their community, to transition to something else is a very difficult ask. And when these stories are largely told only in bubbles of the large cities, then the rural communities really do feel that someone's out there to get us. I've never heard of these stories. I've never heard of these information or the statistics. And here's big city people talking about something completely different, and these changes are happening all to me without any of my knowledge or input or my engagement. And that's not really fair either. So what is that story for the clean tech sector? And I would challenge each and one of you to really think about what story does clean tech want to tell, and to actually tell those stories, not just within the sector, but to largely outside. I don't know how you're going to do that because the clean tech sector is largely a bunch of small players that are really trying to get their products off the market and scale and all of these things. And I don't exactly know how we're going to do that, but it has to be done. It has to be done. Otherwise, there's a whole different universe of facts and information and whole kinds of logic that's built on different facts that are saying that this sector is harmful to them, that it's threatening to them, and that this is all made up by elites in the cities. And we know that not to be true, then we have to tell our stories. And then probably equally important, we have to spend that time listening to the other side. I think that's an exercise that's been lost, the art that's been lost over time. Canada is not a natural state of how people would organize ourselves. This is an exercise and experiment that we've invested to do. Then we have to actually continue to invest in that narrative. And that means not only do we need to tell our stories, but we also need to listen to their stories, actually have meaningful dialogues, and try to, as much as we can, empathize with their stories as well. So what would be your story and the story of the future of clean tech? Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Christine Bergeron. I'm the Chief Member Services Officer with Van City Credit Union. And this afternoon, I wanted to talk about money and change, and more specifically, system change. In my experience, over the past 25 years as a venture capitalist in clean tech, running a hedge fund, doing microfinance, and now as a banker, I've learned that there are two things that you need to affect system change. One, you need money. And you've heard from colleagues on how those flows of money can change outcomes. And two, you need to allocate it in a certain way. So how you actually allocate the money. Of course, you need other things, but you need these two things to affect system change. So let's go to number one, money into clean tech. It's easy to quantify. This particular graph is a number of clean tech companies, but you can look at the amount of dollars. You can look at that from venture, private equity, corporate, you name it. You've heard from other speakers, more money going to clean tech. That's a good thing. We've seen great flows going into renewable energy projects, early stage companies, efficiencies. It's terrific. It's more money is flowing. And with that, the overall cost of renewable energy, as an example, has dropped. Overall cost of ownership has gone down. All good things. Unfortunately, despite this, we're not seeing the overall outcomes that we want. We're not seeing a difference given the temperatures that are changing and the issues that we have with air and water. And in part because we forget two things. There's still more money invested in dirty tech, other sectors, much more so than there is in clean tech. And these improvements, while impressive, are necessary but insufficient for the changes that we need for a sustainable tomorrow. The science is saying it's insufficient. So for that, we need number two, how we allocate capital. And by this, I don't mean whether we allocate it to solar panels instead of fracking. That's flow of funds. That's number one. I don't even really mean who we invest in, although there's an entire other talk on that for sure in terms of diversity. What I mean is, how do we think about the frame? What is our risk assessment? What is the framework? How do we decide whether something's a good investment or not? For decades, we've used the same model, risk return, upside, downside, 3x, 10x, unicorns. I know the model. I've lived it. I understand it. I still live it. And ultimately, the return that we believe we should get for the risk we believe we're taking on. There's two things missing from that, though. First is that actually, typically, it's not just the return we believe we should make, it's the maximum return we believe we should make. And two, we don't always, we do sometimes, but we don't always think about that time frame. So is it an investment for me over the next 5 years? Or is it an investment for my children and their children in 100 years? What is that framework? The risk-return model has been around for decades. I would argue it's insufficient, and it's an imperfect model. A quick story on, this is the price of oil over the years. When I was running the hedge fund, we had numerous investors come in talking to us. This was 2008, before things really unraveled. Some would come in and say, the price of oil cannot go below 80. Others would come in and say, the price of oil is going to have to stay at 120. Can't go below 60. Pick a number. Dozens of companies would come in and speak to us, all speaking as though these were facts and as though these were laws of physics, right? The price of oil had to be something specific. And yet, we speak about commodity prices generally. Yes, there is supply and demand, there's demand elasticity, price models, politics, of course. But the price of a commodity is not a law of physics. It's a human construct. And so what if we reframed our overall risk assessment? Dirty tech and irresponsible investments? What's the true price for the externalities from past decades, the true downside, the true upside you have to see? What discount rate should we really be using? What's the downside of not considering all the stakeholders, of not counting the positive and negatives? I have kids, so what's the true risk framework for the destruction that we are seeing? Dirty air, dead birds, sick kids, extinct species, ice melting. So what returns as a society do we need to financially see? We need to rethink the how. What percentage returns are right? What framework? Some investors have started to do it. We track impact, we pay attention to societal implications, we think about climate justice in the broader respect to clean tech, and we strive to make enough to create a sustainable future. We're not necessarily trying to maximize. And so if we want to see system change, we can't simply hope that more money, although important and absolutely necessary, into clean tech at any stage, but done in a traditional way will be enough. Yes, we will have different returns. Yes, some investments will be riskier than others. But are we really incorporating all of those risks? And that's where number one and number two have to come together. The flow of funds, the large dollars, the true capital that shapes our future. Those investors and those dollars have to rethink the frame. And so although it's certainly a tough challenge, it's not impossible. After all, it's not a law of physics. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd like to begin with an apology. In the Walrus Talks profile, there are several titles behind my name, because I do hold them as founder of the Delphi Group, the CEO of Lumos Energy, the executive director of Indigenous Clean Energy, and one even not listed as chair of the Globe series. But it's a reflection of my career also that I can't hold a full-time job. I've titled my remarks Clean Tech, the Holy Trinity, or How I Found God as a Clean Tech Exporter. I want to tell you how the term clean tech was coined. It was coined by my closest friend, Nicholas Parker, who went on to form the Cleantech Venture Network. I refer to him as the Count of Clean Tech. You can tell him that. And the funny part, when he founded the term clean tech and he wanted to get the URL, he found it was owned by a dry cleaner in Ohio. He negotiated with a gentleman and bought it for $5,000, and whenever he is in Ohio, he gets his suit dry cleaned for free. Now, with Globe, with Delphi, and now in my major work with Indigenous clean energy across the country, we've been tracking clean tech for over 2-3 decades. And it's very telling to me that clean tech is now really at the center of a circular economy. The MacArthur Foundation, in a recent report on the circular economy, really focused on the three mantras of design out waste, keep products and materials in use, and regenerate natural systems. So let's remember to shine a spotlight on the overlooked carbon emissions. While 55% of GHGs come from energy, 45% come from products, production, and use. Now, the classic definition of an entrepreneur is to innovate discovery and take risks, realizing that business failure can be learned to realize opportunity. But let me ask what might be an inconvenient truth. Are we at the takeoff point? Can we actually channel Canadian clean tech business into a world-class global opportunity? The numbers look good, but we kind of have to be truthful and ask ourselves, are we really penetrating markets in a big way, both as Canadian companies and, in fact, as the clean tech sector globally, to really change the vectors that we are on? And more importantly, if not, how do we do that? So can we leverage this era of climate crisis, or I like to call it climate zombie apocalypse, which is way more cool for my kids, to dramatically accelerate clean tech diffusion and scaling up, especially in global markets? We know that's what we want to do. So as we are gathered today as the Canadian Church of Clean Tech, permit me to channel the big picture view of clean tech leaders I engage with in my roles, and put forward collective dialogue of a holy trinity of ideas, ones that'll give you also examples of Indigenous involvement in Canada. And I picked 3 things because for some of us, that's the most we can remember. So I'd like you to hold up your first 3 fingers, and I'm going to go through the 3 things. Hold up your first 3 fingers. Yeah, not the middle finger, sir. No, don't do that. And I'm going through them one by one. Number one. Good. It is way beyond time to break out of the straitjacket of clean tech procurement on the part of governments, including cities, and industry. We really are in an antiquated age of how we view how clean technology can advantage us. In fact, technology writ large, for infrastructure, industry, or for municipal services, or for other government services. The idea of focusing on performance, time, and price as a sole criteria, or in fact a narrow definition of those three criteria, really comprises, in fact, how we can move and how we can get first mover advantage. That's not just for Canada, it's global. And I do think the natural resource sector is a way to start. Let me give you an example. National Defense, not an organization known for innovation, has said, you know what, we're going to use clean power for our armed forces around the country, all our military bases, from Cold Lake to Esquimalt to Halifax. And we're going to do that by securing it from Indigenous communities and partners. And you know what? We're going to take a step with that to attach value to innovation of technology for microgrids, for storage, for making sure the reliability and criterion that we need for power and the clean variety category of that power for greenhouse gases is achieved. And I really like that kind of innovation because it changes the procurement paradigm. So, number 2. By an order of magnitude, our biggest clean tech advantage in Canada is talent. Though look around the room and look at the average age here. We have an enormous pool of young and sometimes not so young innovators and entrepreneurs, including new immigrants, individuals who understand their birth markets. Apprenticeships, mentoring, new job mechanisms that unleash their intelligence and acumen is critical. So I ask myself, you ask me in the Indigenous clean energy sector, what do? We make sure we have programs that connect young Indigenous people like James Harper, a Cree man who's now doing his master's in Sweden in clean energy, and he's coming back to work directly in a clean tech company. So whether it's Indigenous or youth or men and women, we really have to look at that talent pool. If we invest in that talent pool, if we have an apprenticeship program at this event, if we have apprenticeship in your companies, if each of you are mentors to university and college students active in the clean tech sector, I believe that will be our biggest single source of enduring competitive advantage in marketplace, but we haven't hardwired that in the policies and practices in our businesses. And I have a line, you all know what AI is, but I don't think intelligence is artificial. I think it's Indigenous or youth and men and women. And number 3. One of the hallmarks of going global is that we have an evident truth that supply chains have been material to that success. When you have customers, you build relationships and take that global, that helps you go global. Could it be one step further that we create a Canadian clean tech compact between sellers and buyers? We sell stuff to cities. Cities like Toronto or Vancouver are tied in with C40 or C80 groups that act on climate. Could we not work with those cities to help us take us into other cities globally? Are we doing that enough? We know each other here in Canada, but why are we strangers in global markets? That's an accord we'd like to take forward, a huge step forward at Globe 2020 in Vancouver next February. So 1, 2, 3, which reminds me of the classic line, Red Green, one of our country's rural comedians used to have, because we have to change. And he said, I'm a man, but I can change. If I have to, I guess. Thank you.
Okay, literally out of the box. So I'm Stefan Joaquin, managing partner of Intergis Ventures, and I am a serial entrepreneur. I define myself as such because for 20 years I built tech companies from idea to R&D to commercialization to flirting with a potential acquirer to ultimate exit. So one company I took public in London on the FTSE 50 when we were ultimately when I left. And then the other 2 companies were acquired by NASDAQ companies. So after 20 years, I said, what can I do next? Let's try to work on clean tech. Let's work on carbon emissions, climate change, but by way of a fund, which was really hard for me as an entrepreneur, like a hardcore, true entrepreneur. Because to me, the idea of being a fund was like going to the dark side. Because a lot of the funds that I had met, a lot of the financial type people that I had met over my career weren't all such nice people. And so it was a conscious decision nevertheless. And what I want to talk to you about today is what we're doing in clean tech in Canada. It's a very exciting time to be in clean tech around the world and in Canada. But we have to try to refocus ourselves and really understand where we are at with clean tech. I want to talk about capital efficiency and I want to talk about commercialization because I think those two things are so important. So when I threw my hat in the ring and said, okay, let's go make a clean tech fund, I really wanted to defy the status quo, right? It was, as it's unimportant for me to, be tethered to this thing because I really need to move. It was also unimportant for me to raise a type of fund that was exactly structured the way all of the other clean tech funds were structured while we were asking ourselves, why is clean tech not working? Right? So if something's not working, let's try to find new models, let's try to defy the status quo. One of the things that I noticed as an entrepreneur was that either we were underfunding companies because they didn't have all of the qualifications that we were looking for, or we were overfunding companies. What does it mean to overfund a company? Because you really can do that. All the investors jump in together, and when I say all the investors, a lot of them are sort of governmental or quasi-governmental, and are looking for cover, are looking for comfort. So everybody goes in together because this one can say that one was in. If it goes badly, that one can say he was in. Surely it was the other guy's fault. But when everybody jumps in with too much money, the company ends up developing a habit of having a high burn rate and missing on their revenue forecasts. When you miss on your revenue forecasts and you're sitting on a pile of cash, you can find a way to say, well, the revenue's going to come around the bend, it's coming, it's just the customer, it's the regulatory environment, it's the government, whatever it is. You can do that once, twice, 3 times, but investor fatigue sets in, especially if your investors are funds and they're trying to raise a new fund. At some point, the investors are going to say enough's enough. And so capital efficiency is something we need to look at in Canada because I've been to too many events where we put on pedestals the companies who raised a lot of money because our value system is askew. What we're saying is we're thinking that you guys are awesome because you have all of these investors. What we should be saying is we think you're awesome because of how much you did with how little money you raised, right? And I know that this makes sense. You can clap, sir, in the back if you want to. We're bald. It's like a brotherhood. Go ahead. He was doing the silent Canadian clap because we're all so polite. So the second thing is commercialization. Of course, everybody here knows commercialization is important. The EDC is sponsoring this event. I loved working with them in my third company, specifically on commercializing exports. Bless you, sir. It's really important to use these incredible programs that the EDC has on bonding or on PO financing, but commercialization is where the rubber meets the road, right? Because if you are funded, let's say overfunded maybe, and you've got your product in a lab somewhere, ultimately the customer is going to treat your product as you've treated it. So as you've treated it. If you treat it as free, if you allow them to take advantage and do free trials forever because they're trying to prove it out, then you're going to keep deferring your own revenue. You won't be a healthy company. You need to put your foot down immediately and say, no. If you want our technology, we need you to pay for it now, not later. And if you're not, we'll go to the company down the road. And so that's something that I feel companies aren't doing enough. Now, we didn't just want to, state a truism at Energous Ventures. We wanted to be a part of that commercialization outcome. Because anybody can come out and say, I'm the entrepreneur's entrepreneur, right? Every VC on earth is the entrepreneur's entrepreneur. Anyone can come and say, revenues are important. I said so at the board meeting. Of course. Why were you late on your forecast? Well, I heard a great story from the CEO. Anybody can say that. We didn't just want to, talk the talk. We wanted to walk the walk. So we created a very flexible and out-of-the-box fund structure that allowed us to invest in projects and invest in tech companies by way of a more traditional blind pool fund for the types of institutions that need to invest in that type of fund, and also invest deal by deal using an SPV model for more nimble investors who wanted to be able to pick and choose what they want to be in. One way or another, what we did was create a structure that allowed us to create a project, like for example, a really cool tidal hydro project in Canada and in other parts of the world, and then invest in an amazing tidal hydro turbine and platform company. And guess what? The turbines and the platforms are in the project. So the turbine, the tech company has revenues, the project is more efficient and has a higher IRR. We have a company that makes these off-grid solar machines that we are able to electrify the 1 billion people in the world who are off-grid in Africa, India, Indonesia, Philippines, and beyond. And so this company that we've invested in has to go into projects. And so we partner with local companies around the world in those very projects, again, facilitating the commercialization. Another example is we're building the biggest vertical farm in the world, because ag tech is a part of clean tech, right? Carbon emissions don't just come from renewable energy. And so as we go out and build that, it becomes an incredible showcase for portfolio companies. So we've got a company, for example, that we're looking at investing in right now. I won't say their name, but they make an LED light for vertical farms. That it's an amazing Canadian company that can replicate the solar conditions so that that amazing Tuscan basil you had on that trip, okay, the solar conditions in Tuscany through AI and LEDs can be replicated in this vertical farm. So you can create a higher margin product, and you're using a product from a portfolio company in a project that is also quite profitable at an IRR that I'm almost embarrassed to tell you about. And so that's just one example. Because this is a really big project, there's a lot of other places we can put our technologies. We've got a vertical axis wind turbine, that goes on the roof. We've got solar panels, those go in another area. We've got our hydro turbines. Well, there happens to be a fast-moving river just behind this vertical farm. Guess where the turbines are going and connecting to a grid connection that was already there. And so we are looking actively to not just talk the talk, but to walk the walk. And so clean tech, capital efficiency, flexible fund structures, and commercialization focus is what is going to make the difference. Because when we zoom out, and this is the last thing I'll say because I see a flashing red light, when we zoom out, we have to stop self-congratulating. Yes, there's a lot of money from the federal government for clean tech. Yes, there are funds and there are other players, and there's an amazing ecosystem of companies here to go out and do stuff. Yes, the respective renewable energy, for example, markets are doing fairly well on their own, right? So if you listen to the wind industry, you know, it's a good CAGR. If you listen to the solar industry, look, prices are coming down. Everyone is saying that the growth is good. Zoom out, listen to a climate scientist, and then you'll find out that we have to be doing a lot more to avert the inevitability at this point, it seems, that we're going to go past 2 degrees of temperature increase. We cannot allow that to happen. This isn't anymore about our children and our children's children. Please understand that this is happening in our own lifetime. Miami is spending billions of dollars raising roads because of storm surges while voting Republicans who deny climate change. This has to start here in Canada. We have the opportunity to be a leader, but in order to lead this market, we need to think differently about clean tech. We can't just say, oh, I appreciate different fund models, except I'm only really mandated or comfortable to invest in the exact same kind of thing that I did before. We've got to start not just talking the talk, but walking the walk in terms of defying the status quo. And if we do that, we have an incredible opportunity here in Canada, not only to develop our own domestic markets, but to export the bejesus out of our technologies. So thank you very much. Have an awesome time.
So there were 5 in the Walrus Way, 5 perspectives on various aspects of clean tech, and I hope you all appreciate that 7 minutes is a discipline. I'd like to join me in thanking our talkers, Stefan Joaquin, Christopher Henderson, Christine Bergeron, Steve Lee, and Daniel Pino. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank EDC. There's obviously no way the Walrus can do work without our partners' support, so this would not have been possible without EDC. If you enjoyed today's talks, you can watch past Walrus talkers, more than 850 7-minute talkers, wherever and whenever you want on our YouTube channel on every topic known to man. We are not, Stefan, at the Walrus overfunded. We are a national, not-for-profit charitable enterprise, and because fake news is cheap and fact-based journalism is expensive, also please consider joining your fellow Walrus across the country by either subscribing or donating to our work. We have public talks coming up in Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto, and London, Ontario in the next coming 3 weeks. And join us if you can. Thank you again to our Walrus talkers, and thank you to Export Development Canada, and we wish you a very successful rest of the forum and reception. Goodbye. Thank you.